Warning, this podcast contains violence, sexuality, gore, and other horrible and disturbing things. Listener discretion is advised. Also, the hosts of this venture are ignorant dipshits, so please do not take anything they say as fact. And enjoy the show.
Now, are you sitting comfortably? Good. Then we'll begin.
Today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be.
It is our basic human right to be fucked up.
A second plane now has crashed into the other tower of the World Trade Center.
Putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
The defendant shall be incarcerated for the rest of her natural life with no possibility of parole.
You are not machines. You are not cattle. You are men.
We were somewhere around Barstow, on the edge of the desert, when the drugs began to take hold.
Occulte Veritatis. Welcome to Occulte Veritatis. I'm Miriam, and this is my episode about pyramids.
Ooh, Gallifrey.
I'm Sage Murray.
Richard
Leon
Bigley.
Philger. Oh, fuck you, Richard
Fuck
Bigley.
you,
It's Leon
Philger.
I'm
Philger.
already in hell. It's the soundboard demon. Ood, you fuck.
See, this is what we're gonna miss about distance recording. Constantly stepping on each other's dicks.
Oh, don't worry. We'll step on each other's
I sure
dicks
hope
in
so.
person, too.
Yep.
Quite literally, maybe.
I can't wait to fly to Canada so I can step on everybody's dick, too.
I feel the
Nice.
inspiration of Val coming down on this podcast right now.
Hail Val.
Val is actually in Las Vegas right now.
Stepping on dicks, probably.
2800 BC. 4,800 years ago. Before iron tools. Before gears. Before plumbing. Before clocks, coins, cranes, and pulleys. Before forks. Before umbrellas. Before catapults. Before books were a thing. The ancient Egyptians were building monuments into the sky out of millions of stones and years of back-breaking but exact work. Today, we're talking about the pyramids, the culture they come from, the people that built them, and just how these things may have gone up. Also, we're busting some myths and taking some chunks out of the ancient alien motherfuckers. So, enjoy. Welcome to Occulte Veritatis. But first, some poison.
So, what's your poison?
So this What's Your Poison was sponsored. And this is a very wonderful sponsor we have. We love them very much. District Brewing, in the goodness of their hearts, sent us some beers to try out. We are trying the German Pilsner Lager beer brewed in Saskatchewan. Our version of a German-style Pilsner pours a brilliant gold with moderate carbonation. Noble hops balance perfectly with Prairie 2-row malt for a uniquely refreshing approach. Late edition hopping with Czech saws lend this beer its classically delicate aroma, is what it says on the side of the can.
You know what? And fucking District has done it again. This is the second really fucking good beer of theirs I've had out of podcasting.
Okay, I'm extremely
Two for two
jealous
District.
because
You guys
Pilsner
rock.
is my absolute favorite kind of beer, and I am
Oh, this is a good one.
living vicariously through you guys right now.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
this
really
is
good.
a fucking brilliant Pilsner.
The can is a pretty shade. How do you describe that?
Not quite Pepsi blue.
Kind of like a little bit lighter
like
than
the-
a Pepsi
It's
blue.
the color you would paint your
It's
space
prettier
rocket.
than a Pepsi blue.
If I had to launch a rocket into space, I would color it this color.
But
of
he'd
blue.
still name it the Green Bastard for some reason.
I guess I like to be spoiled by my beer and punished by my spirits, and yeah, we got this for free, so I might be biased, but it tastes clean and clear and refreshing and cold, and I quite like it.
I don't know. I find a lot of the smaller beers are very hoppy, and I'm not really a hops fan, but this I can drink.
I would give it an 8 out of 10 because it's refreshing and it has a really good just beer taste. Like it's not like a light beer where you're just like drinking nothing basically. It has like a good beery taste.
I'm
God bless. As you can tell, I'm very classy.
I'm going to rate this getting to shit in a really clean toilet, because I love shitting in a clean toilet, and I really, really enjoy this beer. Thank you, District. You rock. Best sponsor ever.
I was going to say I don't know, I'd go with a 7 out of 10 on this one.
It's a good evening fire pit beer.
This would be...
Oh, I bet this would be really good in a shower.
Yeah, it's a good evening fire pit beer.
This is a good shower beer, yes.
It would be good in the shower, and it would be good in a canoe on a hot day.
Yeah, so I have poison too. I brought my old man shisha vape from...
Oh, yay! I want to hear about the old man shisha vape.
Yeah, so I was excited when they started making shisha-flavored vape liquid, because it is the best for when it's way too hot outside to actually bring out my real shisha pipe. But yes, I have my 1,000-year-old Egyptian man shisha in my vape pen. It's very delicious. I am inside a 1,000-year-old Egyptian man.
Oddly enough, when you say 1,000-year-old Egyptian man, I think of Zahi Hawass, who was the guy in charge of the Egyptian antiquities department, which is obviously a huge thing in Egypt for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But he is exactly what I think of when I think of an Egyptian, is Zahi Hawass.
Yeah, he got arrested during the Egyptian uprising when they decided to try and overthrow the government during Arab Spring. He was arrested for trying to sell Egyptian antiquities. So, total turncoat. Fuck that guy. Very rude. But for a while, he was in every single special about Egypt. Did not matter what it was. If they were talking about Egypt or ancient Egypt, he had a cameo. So he was super great about getting Egypt out there, and just so much FaceTime from Zahi Hawass.
This is something I touched more than 25 years ago. In the middle of the tomb, this beautiful statue was found. I began to clean to discover this statue. She was in the eyes of the ancient Egyptian, Hathor, the goddess of beauty and love. I had my brush. I began to clean. I found the face, a part of the body. And this is when I said, I found my love, archaeology.
Let's set the stage for where these megastructures, the pyramids, were built. I'm going to start a little before they were built, back in 5000 BCE, in the pre-dynastic period in Egypt. There are a few artifacts or writing that have been recovered from this period. It represents about 2,000 years of gradual development from 5000 BC to 3100 BC. It's considered late Stone Age. And in the late Stone Age, for many cultures, they started exchanging the nomadic hunting and gathering for agriculture and animal husbandry, which led to the formation of cities and settlements, since people were able to stay in one place, since they weren't nomadic anymore. Settlements were established and grew, and eventually the settlements that formed in Egypt settled into two main kingdoms. A northern kingdom in the north, known as Lower Egypt, because it was lower down the Nile River. It formed in the many branching rivers that the Nile splits up to as it enters the Mediterranean Ocean. That's where Lower Egypt is. The second kingdom, Upper Egypt, on the upper part of the Nile River, was made from many cities settled along the hundreds of miles of the Nile River. These two kingdoms were sometimes rivals, sometimes allies, sometimes traded with each other, but were autonomous separate kingdoms. Until 3100 BC, a southern Egyptian warlord king united the two kingdoms, and Egypt was born.
He's wearing the royal kilt. He's also got a bull's tail that hangs down beside. These things are only worn by kings.
So, who is he? Quibel turned to two symbols next to his head. The scorpion and a rosette. Together, they gave him a name.
We have other objects that have this little rosette followed by what is clearly a name, so we're reasonably sure that this mesa does in fact show us a king named Scorpion.
From the style of the carving, Quibell realized the mace head must date to early on in Egyptian history. The name alone seems to link him to the first pharaohs.
If you look at the kings of the first dynasty, you have King Fighter, King Fortress, King Cobra, King Slayer of Hearts. And so there's a kind of military or aggressive theme in these names. And I think that's because these kings were first and foremost defenders of their countries and also war leaders. And so King Scorpion with the deadly sting is a perfectly sensible name in that kind of atmosphere.
But Quibell and his colleagues were baffled. The Egyptians left detailed lists of successive dynasties of pharaohs. They were literally set in stone. None bore the name of Scorpion. But then, just yards from where he'd found the mace head, Quibell made a second discovery. It helped locate King Scorpion's place in history.
This is the amazing object we call the Narmer palette, which has been called the first historical document in the world.
The palette is a ceremonial version of a flat stone used to mix pigments and cosmetics. Decorated on both sides, the intricate carving again reveals the image of a king. Two hieroglyphs feature on both sides, a catfish and a chisel. They spell out a name, Narmer. The style of the carving is similar to the mace head depicting the Scorpion King. The figures even wear the same royal headdress. But there is a key difference. There's a second crown worn only by Narmer. It reveals he ruled a far greater territory. Scholars of Quibell's time knew that ancient Egyptians saw their land as having two distinct halves.
There was Upper Egypt, which was the narrow Nile Valley in the south of the country, and Lower Egypt, which was the broad expanse of the delta in the north. And so when a single ruler came to dominate the entire country, the symbolism of his rule echoed those two halves of the country.
Typical portrayals of a pharaoh show him wearing both the tall crown of Upper Egypt and the very different crown of Lower Egypt. Scorpion seems to reign over the south, but Narmer rules north and south. This is the earliest image ever found showing a king ruling over both halves of Egypt.
That leads us into the Archaic period, from about 3100 BC to 2700 BC. Egypt started worshipping their leaders. It started off by having the leader be a thought leader, a leader of culture that guided the development of settlements and how they would build and allocate their resources, and that sort of amplified over time. Eventually, in the Archaic period, kings were seen as godlike beings, identified with either being servants of, or warriors of, or even avatars of gods. Primarily, these rulers, these kings, were seen as avatars of Horus. Now, Egypt wasn't only famous for god kings, that existed in a lot of places on Earth. Egypt was one of the kingdoms on Earth, one of the groups of people on Earth that really started to push technology and innovation. They started to experiment with writing systems. They grew robust trading networks with sophisticated economic systems. They started fucking with agricultural techniques. They started fucking with architectural techniques. Those techniques being refined through the years through innovation and technological development by people motivated by god kings, would result in some of the biggest megastructures in the ancient world, many of which still stand today, being built in the next few hundred years. So Egypt had been united under one banner in the pre-dynastic period. The idea of a single powerful ruler guiding the Kingdom of Egypt formed in the Archaic period along with technological developments. And then we enter the most relevant age of Egyptian history that we'll talk about today, the Old Kingdom, a period of over 500 years, from 2700 BC to 2181 BC, where the majority of pyramid construction took place. In 2700 BC, the Trojans in Asia Minor were just settling. The last of the mammoths were slowly dying off on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean, and the age of sage kings was beginning in China. And in Egypt, the age of the pyramids began, often taking 10 or more years each to build, using upwards of 100,000 people average each.
So the first pyramids were step pyramids, and everybody knows about the Great Pyramid of Egypt, which is in Giza, and obviously it's part of that pyramid complex. But the first pyramids in Egypt were step pyramids, and the first one built was the step pyramid of King Netjerikhet, and it was built in the 3rd dynasty, which was 2650 to 2575 BC. And those are the mastaba tombs. But this one was built above the king's burial chamber. It wasn't an actual real burial chamber. You kind of went under it.
Yeah, it's kind of like a giant tombstone in that way, sitting on top of the burial site. Where a lot of other pyramids, the burial site was inside the pyramid.
So this is a monument that's meant to recreate the primeval mound of creation. So the Egyptians had a religious belief that there was a mound that everything was created from. And so they were using these pyramids to recreate that. So when you died, you went back into this mound. And so what they did was they kind of combined ideas from older burial sites. And they had the step pyramid, and then around it was a big wall. And then inside the wall were dummy buildings, and the whole complex was part of this eternal ceremony of kingship. And in the afterlife, the king would have all of his regal ceremonies just like he would in real life. And this is where the famous Imhotep comes in.
Now again, Egypt has a habit of deifying their leaders, and not only the pharaohs, but also leaders of movements and leaders of projects. They tend to deify them after a time, and kind of same thing happened to Imhotep. What I mean by that is he was a real man, a probable architect of the Step Pyramid, but it's hard to tell what stuff about him is legend and what comes from him as a real historical person. He's known to be a philosopher, a magician in some writings, an architect, a collector of knowledge, a scholar. And many years after his death, he slowly went from historical figure to somebody that was glorified and then deified, as cults built around his name in the late stages of Egypt, hundreds of years after his death.
So he's largely attributed to be the architect of the pyramid, but nobody knows if he's really the architect. But he was the one who had the whole vision of the step pyramid and the whole complex. So he got to have his own statue right at the base of the entrance to the colonnade for the step pyramid. So now he's immortalized for all time.
A little bit ago, you described these tombs as mountains of creation. I'm just trying to get in the head of these ancient Egyptians, like what they believed these structures would do. Did they see them as some spiritual amplification tool, or like, am I thinking about this the right way?
Yeah, the Egyptians had the same kind of divine right of kingship ideas, but it was more also that the pharaoh was a god on earth. You still had the gods as they were in the afterlife, but the pharaoh was not only like divinely appointed, he was the representation of the divine on earth. The pharaoh was a god. So you didn't really go into the afterlife to become a god. You went into the afterlife to kind of complete this spiritual journey. But the Egyptians kind of believed that you had this continuation of your life at in the afterlife. So the king would have his royal duties and kingly ceremonies in the afterlife. So there's kind of this, he's still the God King in the afterlife, but he's not one of the gods. You don't really become a god. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I guess these structures, like, they aren't empty. They were filled with stuff. Stuff that, like, I don't know, a pharaoh could use in their afterlife. Food and pets. Sometimes they would have partners, lovers, concubines buried with them. Servants buried with them. Tools. Lots of different things that, like, you know, if I'm putting myself in their heads, and I think that anything I put into the pyramid is going to come in handy in that pharaoh's afterlife, it could be just a grab bag full of, you know, useful materials to use in the afterlife as your life continues. Do I have that right?
Right, yeah. You kind of saw that when they opened King Tut's tomb and they saw all of, like, boats. So the king could still have his boats, and they would have fishing tools and chariots and all the things you would need in your life. They put that in the tomb for the afterlife as well, because they would believe, okay, well, you need food in the afterlife, so here's food, and you need chariots if you go fight a war, and you'll need your throne to sit in, and so all of those things were put back in the tomb with the afterlife, so you could do those things in the afterlife as well. You were basically going into the afterlife as your God King self.
It appears the boy king was buried in a rush in ice-cramped chambers, so his advisor could seize the throne. The necropolis guards then sealed the tomb, apparently condemning Tut to an eternity of insignificance. Yet for some mysterious reason that has puzzled archaeologists to this day, his would be the only royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings to survive the centuries intact. And when in November 1922 its treasures were revealed once more, it was a global sensation. Yet the discovery was a 1 in a million chance.
With Carnarvon present, they cleared a small hole in the rubble so that they could peer inside, and Carnarvon says to Carter, well, what can you see? And this is the point at which Carter gives us those immortal words, wonderful things, strange images, animals, and gold. Everywhere, the glint of gold.
After years of frustration, the pair had literally struck gold, and they were dumbstruck.
I mean, it's indescribable, really. I mean, this is everything an archaeologist would hope for. It's an intact tomb, exactly as it was left 3,000 years ago. It's as good as it gets for an archaeologist.
The extraordinary find made headlines round the world. Visitors and dignitaries flocked to see this incredible sight. Carter recruited a team to conserve and pack the treasures so they could be moved safely to Cairo. There were gilded couches and a glorious throne, treasure chests and models. At the heart of the tomb was a series of coffins, including an inner one of solid gold weighing 110 kilograms that contained the mummy of the young pharaoh.
Yeah, and it kind of tracks. Like, Egypt has hundreds of pyramids, and a grand majority of them have been raided sometimes in the past. Like, if they're filled with all these valuables, that makes sense. Like, an entire culture's pickings of supplies for the pharaoh to go into the afterlife might be good for raiding.
Yeah, and I think the reason you have certain pharaohs, their burial chambers and their tombs weren't raided was because they were so well hidden. So obviously the pyramids and those larger structures, they were right out there in the open. Very, look at me, I am living forever enjoy your peasant tombs underground, but here's my epic burial tomb. Those were going to be easier to notice and easier to find. I mean, assuming you could get into the chambers, but some of them were easier to raid than others.
You know, they weren't off the mark. If all humans today disappeared, it's estimated that the pyramids will be visible for another 10,000 years. Now, notice I said visible. They won't be destroyed after 10,000 years. They'll be covered up by the sands of the Sahara Desert. But they would survive underneath and could probably be unearthed for hundreds of thousands of years past that. They really are these immortal structures. Well, you know, immortal from a short little shitty human's lifespan anyway.
Oh yeah, for sure. The pyramids are actually the only surviving wonder of the ancient world. Everything else, there was the Temple of Diana in Greece, the Hanging Gardens in Babylon.
What about that big structure carved into the side of a mountain in Jordan? Is that one?
The Pyramids of Giza, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Temple of Artemis in Turkey, the Statue of Zeus in Greece, the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, the Colossus of Rhodes, and the Lighthouse of Alexandria. What you were thinking, by the way, was Petra, Ood, which is not actually a wonder of the ancient world, but is still really cool.
Yeah. I think they actually used Petra in Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade when they're going into that temple to retrieve the Cup of Christ.
I was about to do some commentary that would spoil that movie. I don't know what the cutoff line for spoiling movies is. Like, that movie's fucking old. Like, could I don't know.
No, you can spoil that one. Anyone who hasn't seen it yet.
That movie is almost as old as I am.
Their chance at spoiler free.
I don't remember how old I was when it came out. I think I was like 5.
It came out in 89. It is 32 years old. If you haven't seen Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade in the 32 years it's been out, it's too late. Dude's gonna spoil it.
But I always liked the elegant ending to that movie where, you know, Jesus didn't have a giant gold cup. He wasn't a king, he was a carpenter, so he had a wooden cup. I always liked that part.
It would not be made out of gold.
That's the cup of a carpenter. There's only one way to find out.
You have chosen wisely.
Sorry, I derailed everything.
Yeah. No, we were talking about Mound of Creation.
The Mound of Creation is a name that I've danced under.
Nice. Once you get through the Step Pyramid, that's when you really start the Pyramid Age. And that also significantly changed the way the Egyptian administration and governance and politics really works, because obviously, if you build a huge structure like that, it requires a huge amount of administrative oversight. You need architects, you need all kinds of stuff, just organizing people.
Yeah, and like, we've all seen Prince of Egypt, heard about that part in the Bible. There were slaves that built these pyramids, just slaves, like enslaved people to build the pyramids. But that's not the whole truth. That's a drastic simplification. Also mostly false. The Greek historian Herodotus said that these people were slaves in his writings. And I suppose, like, for the Great Pyramids, seeing 100,000 people working together to build these pyramids, like a historian or a scholar like Herodotus might assume, like, oh, these people must be slaves, especially since slavery was more popular in Greece. So he might have made that assumption, but according to Egyptian writings and actual historical texts, they weren't so much slaves. Now, slaves existed in Egypt, slavery existed in Egypt. There were corvies, people who would have their debt paid by somebody else, and then they would be slaves, paid a wage until their debt is paid off, sometimes days, weeks, months, years. There was forced labor. Sometimes captured prisoners of war from enemy war camps or criminals under the eyes of the Egyptian legal system were forced into forced labor. And also there were slaves. There were just plain old slaves in Egypt. People owned from birth to death by families and people, but compared to other cultures in the world, Egypt's economy relied much, much less on slavery than theirs did. There were some cultures in that time where a large chunk of their economy depended on slavery. But Egypt, if you took all the slavery away, their economy probably wouldn't have suffered all that much, but it was still present within their society. It just wasn't a societal norm.
Right. Their economy was very dependent on agriculture. And if slave labor disappeared in Egypt, then it wouldn't have had a significant impact. I mean, they might miss out on some laboring, but it would have been basic labor in the fields or laborers in like domestic labor, or I don't want to say the lesser jobs because all of those jobs were important, but some of the lower scale jobs. So they weren't losing people who would have done things like craftsmanship. It would have been more like the apprentice level work.
And furthermore, the people that built the pyramids usually weren't picked from these corvies or the forced labor slaves or the lifelong slaves. Usually, the grand majority of people picked to work on the pyramids were talented craftsmen. Every part of the construction had to be done carefully or the entire structure wouldn't fit together. If you're off by a few millimeters on one rock at the bottom and those cuts keep on being made wrong, the pyramid will not stack correctly. It will not be stable. You need exact work. Now, I said there were slaves that helped with the pyramid projects, but they did none of the construction. They didn't cut stones, they didn't drag them, they didn't transport them. Most of what they did were prepare food, wash clothes, sharpen tools, and tended to the beasts of burden that the Egyptians were using to transport stones. People that were required to build each of the great pyramids. And the ratio of those people that were slaves, there are very little slaves that worked on the pyramids, and the few that did tasks that were not related to construction, but instead supporting the workers, feeding the workers, tending to the animals. And if all those slaves disappeared, they still would be able to compensate. Those were just like roles they give people in society that were considered below them. Now, I'm not decrying that. I'm not saying that's good. I'm not saying that's better. Just for you to have a more nuanced understanding of the situation surrounding if slaves built the pyramids, which is mostly no. Now, what was it like being a slave in Egypt? Well, you weren't allowed to leave. You weren't allowed to change the job you were given, but you were allowed to own property. You were allowed to marry an Egyptian woman if you'd like. Strangely enough, in a lot of Egyptian history, an Egyptian woman or an Egyptian man marrying a slave was not looked down upon in that society. Of course, that still involves some immoral power dynamics, an Egyptian marrying a slave that don't have similar powers in their society, but I'm just saying that relatively to other slaves elsewhere, these are things that Egyptian slaves had access to that other slaves elsewhere usually didn't.
The discoveries made at Giza had proved that the builders of the pyramids, far from being slaves, were treated as something of an elite. And they had shown that they numbered 20,000 people, not the 100,000 claimed by Herodotus. But now the bones of the workers were to suggest a remarkable new theory about where these people had come from and why they had come to the pyramids. Many bizarre theories about the pyramid builders have been based on the conviction that the Egyptians themselves could not have built such enormous structures.
It's very important to know that they were Egyptians. They were not people who came out of the space. They were not came from lost civilization as we hear these days. Many stories that do not really have any truth in it at all.
Now let's talk about these craftsmen, the people that made up the grand majority of the people that worked on the pyramids. They were highly trained. They apprenticed under old masters for years until they learned their craft. Much like the journeyman-apprentice relationship of today. They were usually chosen to be craftsmen by nobles or political leaders in Egypt and placed into a work project. They were not allowed to travel from their work sites or switch jobs. They were kind of married to whatever project they were placed on. But writings at the time seemed to say that they considered themselves lucky to be chosen for the job. Like this was an honor to be chosen as one of the many people to work on this great pyramid. And tombs have been unearthed containing workers and craftsmen that work on the pyramids. So we have a pretty good idea of the average person that worked on these pyramids, and they show that they were well paid. They were considered middle class at the time. The quality of their bones and the health of their bodies indicated that they enjoyed good food and nutrition. They showed signs of healing from injury and broken bones, showing that they were taken care of, and then were allowed to work for years after that fracture took place. They lived fairly long lives for people at the time. They were shown to be healthy and well paid and had lives that at least led to a high enough quality in their life that bones were in fairly good dense condition. Now, I'm not saying that operational health and safety wouldn't have a problem with how they were working. They were probably still being overworked. Workers' rights really wasn't a huge thing back then, so they did show signs of being overworked. Some of the bones showed that their vertebrae had been degraded over time. There were bends in their bones that have been shown to come from years of heavy labor and heavy lifting things. You can see it in modern workers today that overwork themselves. Their bones will start to change shape, and just like them back then. So it gives this impression of a healthy, well-fed and watered, well-paid worker that was still working fucking hard, probably many, many hours a day for up to 10 years at a time. And after they were done one 10-year project, maybe they'd be moved to another to build another upcoming pyramid. It was a well-paid, healthy, well-fed, but labor-intensive life building these pyramids.
I hadn't seen anything like this before working in Egyptian archaeology. Alongside these benches, we found fish bone embedded in the floor. When we analyzed the bone that we so meticulously recover, every scrap of animal bone, our animal bone specialist tells us there's an awful lot of cattle. And cattle was very expensive meat, came from the provinces. And a lot of the cattle that we're finding here is prime cuts and under 2 years of age. So everything about our site suggests it's expensive.
Meat and fish seemed like an unlikely diet for the pyramid builders if they were slaves. What was emerging was a picture of a large and well-fed workforce provided with the best foodstuffs available at the time. But the full truth as to who exactly these people were was to come from the workers themselves. From the workers' bones, the first ever profile of the pyramid builders was painstakingly pieced together. More than 600 skeletons have been unearthed so far from the workers' tombs. One by one, as they are found, scientists in Cairo have been examining every bone. From the very first, there were surprises.
The first thing we met with was a female skeleton. And then we found males and females and children as well.
When we made the demography of this material, we found that between the adults, we have the 50% are males and 50% are females. And the percent of the children, it was about 23.6%. And this is a very high percentage of children.
The extraction of the DNA of the bones are difficult, and especially if the bones are old. But they were not contaminated, they were well preserved, they were preserved by the sand, and they were not exposed to light or winds, and that's why our DNA yield is good. Really, it was very, very nice to see that there is a relationship, that is to say, a very close compatibility in the genes, so we classified them as a family.
البتاع ده بالحمى الماده اللي هم جابوها ببطرمان دي. الماده بعدين الحوت.
Forensic study of the remains tells a tale of suffering and sacrifice. Some workers' lives were claimed by labor so grueling it was literally backbreaking.
In the study of the bones that we found, most of the men that has been found in the cemetery, they had stress on their back, on the bones of the back, meaning that those people were involved in really moving stones or working in the pyramids or working in the tombs.
The biggest pyramids are the pyramids at Giza. And the reason they chose Giza is because the Giza Plateau is visible from Saqqara, but it's also virgin ground back then. Nothing had been built there before, and it was really prime, I guess you could call it prime real estate, but...
Virgin ground is a name that you've danced on.
Yes, yes, I have.
And from what I understand, the base of this pyramid, the location for these pyramids, was made of like solid stone instead of just stone on the outside and sand in the middle, like with some previous pyramids that led to some collapse.
Right, exactly. So that geology underneath was limestone, and it was able to really bear the weight of the huge monument. And it's also near the Nile, so all the building materials were close by, and anything that wasn't, you could get there by boat.
There were other pyramids, most famously the Bent Pyramid, built in 2600 BC, that basically were built on an area that had stone on the outside and sand in the middle. So during construction, the middle started to show signs of instability and cave in. So they had to change the angle of the pyramid halfway through, and it is now the Bent Pyramid. Look it up. It looks a little strange.
Oh, yeah. So they really had to learn how to perfect the actual shape of the pyramid. That's why you see that kind of progression from the Step Pyramid to the Bent Pyramid, and then finally to the Great Pyramids. And it's really just this huge project, and thinking about just the amount of not just work that went into it in terms of labor, but the amount of planning and the number of people, just the architecture inside and outside was pretty significant. And I mean, it's not just that, it's like a project of absolute power. I mean, if you think about the power that the king has to be able to direct that. And then it's just, I mean, when you think about it, the epitome of monumentality, indestructibility, it's just always going to be there, it seems like. It's just this monument that everybody thinks about when they think about these permanent structures, all these monuments. So it's me nerding out about this because it's not just my culture and heritage, it's just seeing the different ways that people have built pyramids as well. I mean, when you look at the kinds of pyramids that the Aztecs built, those are amazing as well. And for them, it was very ceremonial in terms of the way they used their pyramids as more as like temples that you would use on a daily basis. And you see these kind of temple pyramids in Asian countries as well, but we see them more as temples, but they really do look a lot like pyramids in the Aztec sense. But the Egyptian pyramids are like solid, and it's immense when you think about it. So now let's go into why they were built. The Great Pyramids in Giza are actually a complex of 3 pyramids, with the biggest one being built by and for Pharaoh Khufu, and those were built in the 4th dynasty. So they're a funerary complex, much like the previous ones, and they're meant to house the pharaoh, his wives, and his wife and his mother. And they also originally included 2 temples that were built to honor Khufu. The whole project took 20 years to complete. And in addition to being the final resting place of the pharaohs, the whole necropolis had religious significance as well. I'll go a little bit more into the idea of the primeval mound. This is actually symbols of worship for the god Nefertum, and he was considered the source of all life. And some scholars, they kind of think that maybe the pyramid was a part of a devotion to the gods, but it could have also just been the idea behind being a convenient structure that you could build tall enough and big enough. So the primary function, though, is definitely the burial site for the kings and queens. As I mentioned before, in addition to holding the bodies, the pyramids were also stocked with boats, wooden statues, stone carvings, food, and clothing, everything the Egyptians believed they needed in the afterlife.
Part of their spirituality was connected to this physical body, this earthly body that these pharaohs had. What I mean is they used mummification and even drying and preserving of certain organs to preserve the body. They seem to have a belief that they need the earthly body to be intact in some way in order to be useful or helpful after death.
Right, because if the earthly body after death was desecrated, then when the spirit was coming back to the body after its daily or nightly travels to the spirit world, it wouldn't be able to find the body, and it would just sort of drift between the 2 realms, the earthly realm and the spirit realm, and it would never be able to rest. So having a body that was preserved, ideally forever, was very important.
The Egyptians knew that the hot, dry desert sand was good for preserving the dead. Mummification also involved a drying process and a thorough knowledge of anatomy. Once they got the corpse back from the family, it was washed and then it was laid out on an enormous table, and the chap with the instruments would get to work. First of all, they cut a hole in the left-hand side, and then they had to collect the various organs, because some of them were very important in the afterlife. They couldn't leave them in the body because they'd rot, so they kept them in special jars called canopic jars. Now this one, he's got a face like a baboon, and he's called Happy, and he's for the lungs. So, pull them out, stuff them in the jar, and they'll be nice and safe, and we'll keep them there in the tomb with him, so he can have them in the afterlife. They should have been bigger, these canopic jars, but, you know, we couldn't run to that. The liver, the stomach, and the lower intestines went into the 3 remaining jars. They also took the brain out, and the way they did that was quite simple. At the back of your nose, you've got a thing called the ethmoid bone. Ethmoid meaning it's like a sieve, and it's perforated. You can go through it very easily. And then they would take a hook and shove that into the brain and stir it round a good deal. That would turn the whole brain to liquid, and then it would be much easier to get it out. And imagine that this is Marty's brain. You stir it round, and the whole lot liquefies, and then you can simply pour it out through the nose like that. It's easy. And then finally there was the heart. Now, they didn't take the heart out because the heart carries a record of all your past deeds. And so you need that when you start the afterlife, because you're going to be interrogated by the gods. And if you speak the truth, then you are said to be of sound voice, and you're allowed through into the kingdom of Osiris. Now we have to dehydrate him. This is natron. It's actually a mixture of sodium carbonate and bicarbonate, and it's found sort of lying around in the desert. And basically we cover him with a great heap of this, all the way over, several feet deep, and we leave him for 40 days. We brush off all the natron, get rid of that, and then we have to anoint him with oil. And here we have some oil, and just take a little bit of that. Ooh, rather a lot. Give us an arm, Marty. And that'll keep out all the bacteria which would otherwise come in and make him go rotten from the outside. Finally, when he's thoroughly oiled, the bandages. And I think I'll start with the foot, and then they've got to bandage the whole body. And there he is, perfectly preserved. He'll be incorruptible, he'll be unchanging and unmoving for 1,000 years.
And you didn't have just this physical protection. You also had, inside the mummy, amulets and protective jewelry, and it was protected in the coffin. So you had all these extra layers of protection, both spiritual and physical.
And some of these builds got complex, like false entrances, like misleading red herring hallways, even some evidence of different traps and different ways to dissuade robbers from coming into the pyramid. Having all these interior spaces requires that the thousands of stones that surround these interior spaces are cut in an exact way, or there won't be room. If any stone is off by even a little bit, the whole structure won't fit together. It'll be like, mismade Lego pieces. You're not going to be able to build a Millennium Falcon if all your pieces are shitty. The way they organize their workers and levels of hierarchy and experience and authority sounds very familiar to actually how we do. So when you look into these tombs, and you look into the writings of the Egyptians and how they account for all the jobs needed, you find titles like the supervisor of the masons oversees all the masons on the project, and the director of craftsmen crafts a certain group of masons, and the stone cutters direct the masons who are dedicated directly towards cutting stone. It kind of sounds like managers and supervisors and site leads and stuff like that. And they had these special labels for a bunch of different roles in their society. Like there was even a supervisor of cooking that cooked food for the people that were building the pyramids.
Nazlet El Saman, a small suburb of Cairo, was the unexpected site of one of the most important finds in Egyptology. A mechanical digger being used in construction work on the edge of the town hit a large block buried in the sand. The construction stopped, and archaeologists moved in. The block unearthed by the digger turned out to be the wall of a large building. As they dug through hundreds of tons of sand, a team of archaeologists began uncovering signs of a vast settlement dating from 2,500 years before Christ. It stretched for half a square mile, but there were signs of it extending much, much further. Could this be where the people who built the pyramids had lived? What's been called the lost city of the pyramids? The team was led by Egyptologist Mark Lehner.
We have some things here that look like workers' houses, but most of what we're finding looks as though it's geared towards production. One of the first things we found were intact bakeries, where they made bread in these enormously large pots. These could be massive things, sometimes weighing up to 25 kilograms. Big, thick pots. They have these ledges, they look like bells when they're upside down. Each one of these pots was kind of like a portable baking machine.
Hundreds of bread molds and many baking pits was evidence of food production on a vast scale.
And a lot of these jobs had supervisors and training and years of development and apprenticeship to master them, and there was a lot of experience going into all the roles involved in this pyramid project.
Yeah, and you need people who are highly trained because those stone blocks were very expertly crafted, and they're cut to very specific details, and then the plans would have required significant amount of forethought, and even including the insides of the pyramids. Those were very well crafted, and even the inscriptions, the painting, that has to be done by people who are expert craftsmen. And I don't think you can ever dispute that it wasn't a hard job, but you're going to see also in the archaeological studies that they found things like cattle bones at the build sites, which indicates that they were fed very well, because people in ancient Egypt just didn't eat meat every day. It was more of an occasional thing.
Yeah, it seems like peanuts to us here in the modern age. We can just run to the supermarket and get a slab of meat, but it requires a lot of time and dedication, and back then, for a people of their technology level, of their level of stratification in their society, taking an animal from birth to a stage where you can butcher it for meat is a big multi-year investment. And these people sometimes ate herds of cattle every day. Herds of hundreds of cattle were slaughtered every day to feed the workforce of thousands that worked on these pyramids. It was an investment on a grand scale, not only the cost to pay all these workers, because they were paid, but to pay for all the infrastructure surrounding it, feeding and watering and caring for all these people and their tools and their accommodations while they were there, eating up herds of cattle and sheep and goat.
And you also found the pots of beer that they would give to the workers, and there were indications that they were fed very well on site as well. So you just wouldn't expect that of slaves.
Yeah, and when some of the living spaces of these workers and these craftsmen were unearthed, you see them having belongings in their home that indicate that they had money for optional things, like, you know, if you're desperate, you'll spend your money on what you need to survive first, and then afterwards, when you have more money, you'll spend it on optional stuff. Art and statues and instruments and collectibles and stuff like that. People of a lower wage will buy this stuff as well, because humans crave that kind of stuff, but the amount that was found in these workers' homes indicate that they had an excess of wages that they felt free to spend on different things, which indicates they were fairly middle class in their society, able to have enough money to have a collection of something, or to have a wooden statue of a family member made, or to have a painting made of yourself hanging on your wall, that kind of stuff.
But you also have, on the flip side, the things like the Bible, and the Hebrew Bible also has a lot of stories of the Hebrew slaves in Egypt. And so people have made those connections that, well, Egypt had slaves and the Israelites were slaves, therefore they must have built the pyramids. So it's very hard to overcome that kind of thing.
Alrighty, a day in the life of a builder of the Pyramid of Giza. Now, the Pyramid of Giza had about 5,000 full-time salaried employees that would be beside the pyramid throughout its build, or for long, years-long periods in the build. They would build cities nearby the pyramid, like functioning cities of these 5,000 full-time employees, often growing into cities by their own rights. They had warehouses and theaters and public gathering areas, bakeries, leisure centers, and in the part of the year where farming couldn't happen in Upper Egypt, about 20,000 farmers or other seasonal workers would be brought in for 3 to 4 month shifts, rotating throughout the year. Obviously, they got more of them during the non-farming period, but there was other seasonal jobs that they rotated out of. Now, these 20,000 odd people that were with the 5,000 full-time employees stayed in the borders of these work towns, often in modest accommodations, such as tents or work camps. But even these people in these temporary structures were fed well and had time for leisure and were allowed to enter the main worker city to enjoy the amenities there. It's just that where they slept at night were these temporary structures, since they were only there for a few months rather than years at a time. So this is the day in the life of these workers. Now, this is going to be a day in the life of a block carver and transporter. At about 6 a.m., the craftsman would be awake. If he was a full-time employee, he would be in his mud and papyrus home. If you were a temporary worker in the work camp, you would awaken in a tent. It's a sizable tent, probably one you could stand up in. Probably a tent with multiple rooms, but a temporary tent nonetheless. In either place, you would have an Egyptian breakfast. And as a worker on the pyramid, your food would be well funded. They wanted to keep you well fed and happy as you were working on the pyramid. You would have a breakfast of figs, dates, probably some beer brewed in Egypt, flatbread, similar to pita. At about 7 a.m., you would head to the work site. You have been working there for about a decade off and on if you're a temporary worker, or for a decade straight if you are a permanent employee there, a full-time employee. Now, a lot of writings of the time have a repeating theme from the perspective of both temporary and full-time workers. And that sentiment being that they felt lucky to be working on the project. They felt blessed to be helping construct this megastructure for the pharaoh to be put in when he dies. Now, this probably wasn't ubiquitous. There's probably lots of Egyptian workers who hated their lives, hated their job. There's probably still many more that were doing it, quote-unquote, just for the mortgage. I don't know if mortgages existed back then, but regardless. We're doing it just for the paycheck, and they thought it was a good job with a good income, and you get fed well. So that's why they are doing it. But the general ethos of the time, the theme that came up again and again in writings, seems that workers thought they were lucky to be working on the project. So you're rolling into your work site, feeling lucky to be working on the project. You have a collection of tools. If you're a temporary worker, you probably maintain these tools yourself. If you were a full-time worker, you might have a slave or even an apprentice that keeps your tools sharp and maintained for you. Probably copper drills and chisels and hammers and the like. And you would start work carving blocks. So you might carve for a few hours, depending on the size of the block and the sharpness of your tools and the skills of the craftsman. This block could take anywhere from 3 to 10 hours to cut. Let's go 3 hours. So, for 3 hours, you and an entire crew are working all around this rock, cutting it to within millimeters of what it's supposed to be, precise. At about 10 a.m., the block falls loose. Another stone released, ready to be put into the pyramid. Now, there are many different theories as to how they transported these stone blocks. Some say that they built little wooden axles on the corner of them so they could slip these greased logs underneath to reduce friction and basically drag them along as these slick logs underneath acted as primitive wheels. There were theories that they just simply dragged the stones. There's experiments where they got 18 men to drag stones the same size and shape and weight as the stones used for the pyramids over dry ground, wet ground, and up a 1-in-4 inclined ramp. And those 18 men were able to move the stone in all three situations. Of course, making the ground wet to make it like a muddy slurry reduced the friction on the stone by 50%, meaning that theoretically 9 men could have moved that stone. Even up a fairly sharp incline, those 18 men were able to move the stone about 1 foot a second, just by heaving and hoeing. Now, let's say that you're at a pyramid that has a quarry nearby. Depending on what theory you believe in how these Egyptians moved the stones, and it could be all of the above. They could have had many methods and tried many different things to move the stones. You would spend the next part of your day dragging or pulling or floating this stone down a river using wrapped up reeds to make it buoyant. There's lots of theories out there. For the next 3 or so hours, you would transport this stone, you and a team of a bunch of men, probably around 18 men, transporting this stone. At 1 p.m., you break for lunch. Again, you're well-fed, well-funded. You eat bread, fish, fruits, beef, and other quality, nutritious food. And you take about an hour off for lunch. And at 2 p.m., you start the hauling of this stone again. Back-breaking work under a hot sun. This isn't an easy job. There are breaks to rehydrate, but there can't be too many or you lose daylight. And you get that stone to the base of the pyramid at about 4 p.m. The team of 18 men start to drag that stone up about a 14 or 15 degree incline. In some theories, slowly winding around the pyramid so that the stone can be taken to whatever stage the pyramid is in, and slotted into where it's supposed to be. At about 6 p.m., you get to the spot where the stone is supposed to be. Let's say the Pyramid of Giza is half done. That would put you about 200 feet off of the ground below, on a ramp, dragging this massive stone. You, with the help of specialized masons up top, would slot the stone into its place. You're done your work for the day. 1 stone in, 2 million to go. You break for supper, and you have a hearty meal of beef, mutton, carrots, lentils, onions, and a healthy serving of beer. You have time for leisure and family time in the evening. You might even go to some of the settlements in the permanent workers' village, maybe an entertainment spot, maybe a theater. You would typically go to sleep at about 11 p.m., ready for your day to begin at 6 a.m. tomorrow, dragging 1 more heavy stone.
A hoof plunged through the vaulted roof of a tomb that was sealed in the time of the pharaohs. Inside was a glimpse of eternity. The vault was coated with richly colored plaster, which began to disintegrate the moment it was exposed to the desert air. But for a brief time, it shone as beautifully as the tomb of a king. But the man buried here was not a king, or even a nobleman. He was a worker.
Because of the size of his tomb, because of the unique shape of the vaulted ceiling, and also because it was cased inside with plaster, then I believe this is the man who was in charge of the whole administration of the workmen. This is the man who wanted to be sure that all these people live in a good living, and they go early in the morning to work, and they come by in the sunset, and they live in the village, and at the same time when they die, there is a tomb for everyone.
In the months following the discovery of the vaulted tomb, Dr. Hawass and his crews unearthed more than 250 additional graves in the same area. They had found an entire cemetery for workers. The foreman's vaulted tomb is surrounded by the graves of his honored staff. Like the tombs of the pharaohs and noblemen, the workers' graves were probably arranged according to their status. Dr. Hawass found that some tombs displayed hieroglyphic job titles, further proof that the ancient builders of Giza were highly regarded craftsmen.
We found here 3 false doors. Above each one, we found painted stela. We found in the titles of those people the hieroglyphic inscriptions saying that Khirb Yerius means director of building tombs, and Sahaj Yerius means inspector of building tombs.
Okay.
During excavation, archaeologists made another discovery that helped confirm the workers' status. Like the kings, the builders saw to it that pieces of art accompanied them in eternity. Detailed engravings, hieroglyphics, and small statues offered a glimpse of how the ancient workers actually looked.
There we go, Pyramids Part 1, and God, it's good to be back. I won't keep you for long this time. This piece of music is what's known as the oldest known melody, known as the Hurrian Hymn No. 6, written about 1400 BC. And as old as this melody is, remember that it's much younger than the subject of this episode and the coming episode. See you in Pyramids Part 2, where we try and answer the question, how the fuck did these things go up? Here's an update to case number 41, R. Kelly. Now, when we started covering this story, allegations were just starting to come public and enter the public eye. Major news networks had not picked up the story quite yet. We scooped them by a few months. You know, Hail B. Val and all that, she guides our researching hand. But the update to this story that we have to add since we've been gone is, on September 27th, 2021, a jury found Robert Sylvester Kelly guilty of 9 counts, including racketeering, sexual exploitation of a child, kidnapping, bribery, sex trafficking, and violations of the Mann Act.
I have been practicing law for 47 years. During this time, I have pursued many sexual predators who have committed crimes against women and children. Of all the predators that I have pursued, however, Mr. Kelly is the worst, for many reasons. First, he used the power of his celebrity to recruit vulnerable underage girls for the purpose of sexually abusing them. These were not May-October relationships, which is what his defense attorney wanted the jury to believe. These were crimes against children and some adults. Second, he used the power of his business enterprise and many of his inner circle employees to assist him and enable him in his plan and his scheme to lure his victims to him, isolate them, intimidate them, control them, indoctrinate them, punish them, shame them, and humiliate them. All of which made Mr. Kelly more powerful and more dangerous than many other sexual predators who operate without a network of financial and businesses to support and enable them. Third, the government proved that Mr. Kelly had genital herpes, that he knew that he had it, but failed to disclose it to his underage victims and adults, and that he failed to use condoms to protect them and lower the risk of contracting it. As a result, many of his victims contracted this sexually transmitted infectious disease from him and will be forced to suffer from it for the rest of their lives. Fourth, in many cases, Kelly, after grooming, isolating, and intimidating his child victims, recorded them being sexually abused and humiliated by him. He directed these videos and produced them, not only for his own sexual gratification, but in some instances for the purpose of using these videos to silence and threaten his victims with public exposure of these tapes if they ever revealed what he had done to them. These tapes were not sex tapes. They were child pornography, which is a crime. In their closing argument, the defense had the nerve to bring up the name of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. What they failed to mention is that Martin Luther King Jr. said that, quote, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character," end quote. That is what the jury did today. Based on the evidence, the jury must have concluded that the defendant, R. Kelly, was no Martin Luther King Jr. Instead, R. Kelly is a sexual predator who is guilty of very serious federal crimes. The defense should be ashamed of even mentioning the name of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in any discussion of R. Kelly, a dangerous sexual predator who has harmed so many women and underage girls. The defense also argued that Mr. Kelly treated his victims, quote, like gold, end quote, targeting them, recruiting them, isolating them from their family and friends, forcing them to follow his abusive rules in order to control them, punishing them if they did not follow his rules to the letter, hitting them, threatening them, sexually assaulting them, giving many of them genital herpes, and victimizing them by recording many of them on child pornography tapes, is not treating them like gold. R. Kelly thought that he could get away with all of this, but he didn't.
He's due to be sentenced May 4th, 2022. Alrighty, that's it for this week. Next week, join us as we tell the story of how these pyramids go up. It's good to be back. Here's to 4 more years of OVPod.